with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, May 7th, 2020. I'm Michael Brooks, broadcasting from the quarantine zone. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. Very far from the industrially ravaged canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On this week's program, on today's program, Guillaume, former Foreign Minister of Ecuador, senior analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. We're talking about the mercenaries in Venezuela, the recent extremely questionable conviction, lawfare conviction of former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa. What is lawfare in Latin America? Covering all of that with him. 3.2 million more Americans claim unemployment. Staggering numbers. We're up to 33 million in 7 weeks. The Trump administration is shelving Center for Disease Control guidelines on reopening the country as they recklessly push forward. Trump's allies on the Hill, including Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, and Chuck Grassley, see an opportunity to attack immigrants, and they're taking it. What was Silvercore, the mercenary firm involved in this attempted coup in Venezuela? What were they doing in Brazil in 2018? New piece in Brazil Wire documents their presence. Pompeo continuing to escalate with China. He's accusing it of withholding key information. Bill Barr is urging a tactical shift in the Trump administration's effort to strike down key provisions in Obamacare. Justice Department investigates Blue Flame Medical after claims that it failed to provide masks in Maryland. And Brazil's COVID cases are rising. Iran is under threat of a resurgence, no small part due to U.S. sanctions. Top Republican fundraiser and Trump ally named Postmaster General, giving the president new influence over the post office. And Iraq has formed a new government after 6 months of uncertainty. And everybody's, well, maybe you haven't, but there is a video of a cold-blooded murder of a 25-year-old black man jogging in Georgia, and no charges have been brought up in this case yet. All that and much, much more on today's Majority Report. So we want to actually start with this, this case in Georgia. And, you know, individual cases of horrific and despicable things happening are important in and of themselves, but the point here is to find a theme and a structure. And we have seen multiple cases where, I mean, there's the issue of police violence, which is a problem in this country systemically, relating to over-incarceration, and it distributes across all states and all lower class populations, of course, disproportionately people of color as well. Then there's a case like this, which has extensive connection to law enforcement, which you'll see in this clip. But this is just an act of terrorism. It's a hate crime. It's an act of terrorism. It's there for everybody to see. And we don't have any charges. So we're going to start with a clip here from Ahmaud Arbery's family's lawyer explaining the case here, the facts of the case, and the lack of charges. Let's play that clip.
Joining me now is Wanda Cooper, Ahmaud Arbery's mother, and S. Lee Merritt, the attorney for Mr. Arbery's family. Tell me, Attorney Merritt, what happened here and why haven't we not seen a grand jury convened to really go through the facts here when we have an unarmed young man jogging that's dead?
What you have was 3 Southern Georgian white citizens who essentially put together a posse and lynched a young man in broad daylight. Ahmaud Arbery, by all accounts, even those of his accusers, was seen running down the road. He was wearing sneakers and exercise gear. He was not carrying any firearms, or he wasn't carrying any stolen material. The worst that could be said about him was that he stopped at a home that was under construction and that he allegedly looked in through the window before carrying on his jog. The reason that we have not seen an indictment, in my opinion, is because these men were white. These men have strong law enforcement ties. The father, Gregory McMichael, being law enforcement for 30 years, specifically working in the district attorney's office, who would have been responsible for arresting these men. That DA recused herself. It passed over to the next county, and there the district attorney failed to disclose his close ties to this family. Ms. Cooper, and her diligence and her family discovered those ties and asked that he recuse himself. He did, but not before offering a very poor opinion on the state of the law that would have justified the shoot.
So we're waiting here, and that's sort of the bottom line, people. That is the bottom line. You can, we're not going to play this video. You can see it if you want. Could not be more clear what happened here. This young man is out jogging. These guys pull up on him in a truck, ask for him to stop, come over, and then end up murdering him in cold blood. And there's no doubt, obviously, one of these people who murdered him was a 30-year veteran, as the attorney pointed out there, of the local police department. There's connections with the DA. And now we're waiting on a grand jury. One thing we wanted to just highlight, in addition to the courage of this family and how important this case is, and obviously we'll keep following it, but the attorney there who's doing his job to speak with precision, but just the idea that the only thing, because supposedly what these guys were doing was looking for a burglar. Now, why this was their responsibility, why you wouldn't just call the police, why you would think a burglar was out jogging, I mean, obviously all of these things speak to, in fact, the racial terrorism of the incident. But he felt a need to say the only thing you could say about Ahmaud Arbery was that he looked inside a house that was under construction. Brendan and Matt, have you guys, let's do like the full span here. As a kids, have you ever, I don't know, maybe even like gone trespassed on a construction site that you weren't supposed to because it was interesting, or you want to check out what's going on? I definitely have. And today as adults, do you guys ever like walk up by construction sites and look inside them?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like realtors don't mind people doing that, like especially if they're prospective buyers. And yeah, I mean, I grew up in a new development, so everything around me was new houses, and I went inside of those things all the time. I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a very plain example of examining one's own privilege. Because I know my grandparents lived in a community in South Carolina, not far from where this was, and they're always doing construction down there. it's always being done, and there are always people out walking about because it's nice out generally, and like it's not unusual for people to just look in to someone's house.
Right. So a completely normal behavior that indicates absolutely nothing, that almost
totally
any
irrelevant to
completely
like guys.
irrelevant,
Yeah.
normal, you would track it. Someone taking a run and checking out a new developed house there's nothing exceptional or interesting or relevant about it. But this good attorney who is taking on some obviously very dangerous forces there in Georgia feels a need to clock that. And he's probably right. But we all need to take the lesson, what the lesson and the upshot of that is, which is that even in a context where you're talking about a young black man murdered in cold blood while he's out running, taking a run, that something completely irrelevant and innocuous that he did still has to be acknowledged as a point of contention in a crime where there is the murder video, there is the ISIS video. So we will continue following that case. And obviously, what else can you say? It's evil, it's despicable, it reflects much bigger problems and serious danger and inequity. And also, one can only imagine, to go through that as a family. Your son is murdered in cold blood, and the murderers are insulated, at least so far. We're waiting on a grand jury. Maybe, as we say, hope springs eternal. Something will come forward as a result of this becoming a national media story. Anyway, and this is not, this is one and obviously I'm not a lawyer, but I don't see. There was another clip where they, with the same attorney, where they quoted from a Charles Blow column, essentially saying that, in some cases like this, what has happened is obvious and the moral consequence is obvious, but there's a technicality. I don't see any technicality here. Anyways, we are going to get straight to our guest, who is joining us now from, I believe, from Washington, D.C.
I'll admit him now.
Oh, okay. You'll admit him now. Sorry, I just got the IM.
Yep.
Of course, you should. Okay, joining us now, connecting as we speak, real-time production. Is Guillaume Long. He's a former foreign minister for Ecuador, and he's now a policy analyst based in Washington. Guillaume, are you there?
Yeah. Hi, Michael. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Cannot see you. Can hear you very well.
Okay. Is that better?
Well, now you're to the side. Is there a way? I don't know if we could make
the phone
that
is
vertical.
Sideways.
Yeah, it's a horizontal shot instead of a vertical. Or there we go.
Perfect.
Hey, okay. And tilt down. I think that's good. Okay, Guillaume, thanks so much for being here.
No, thank you for having me on the show.
How is everything there? I hope everybody is safe and okay, as we always say to everybody when they join us.
We're fine. Yeah, thank you very much. How about yourself?
Absolutely, we're okay. It's still pretty intense here in New York, but
yeah,
thankfully we're okay so far. So mercenaries caught apparently pointed out by fishermen in Venezuela, engaged with by the Venezuelan military. It turns out they're part of a mercenary firm called Silver Corps. Can you talk about this coup attempt in Venezuela? And how you think it fits with this, broader Trump administration efforts in Latin America. And also, we'll talk about it later. There's some reporting that Silver Corps was present in Brazil in 2018. What is the role of these mercenary firms in this type of foreign policy today?
Yeah, so I think it's essentially a global phenomenon. You're getting more and more privatization of military or paramilitary presence around the world. It's something the United States has been well accustomed to now for several decades, but it's been on the rise in the last, well, this century probably. And it's kind of a great way of, history and hopefully sooner than history, journalists will eventually uncover to what extent the current US administration was involved in this particular attempt at a coup, at an invasion, at an assassination, whatever it was in Venezuela. But certainly more generally, it's a great way of, if it succeeds, claiming victory. And if it fails, sort of, oh, I had nothing to do with this kind of response, which is what we got from the current Trump administration this time around. So it's a useful tool because you can, not be seen as being directly involved unless you want to be directly involved because the operation is successful. And, it's something which, when I was at the UN, is constantly on the agenda. So countries from the global south are constantly complaining about this. There's an actual item in the UN and the Human Rights Council on mercenaries because it's been something recurrent in Africa, very recurrent in Africa. So African countries, it's a big deal for them. And it's something that's been recurrent also in Latin America. Cuba's had a long history of sort of privateers. I mean, obviously going back to the Bay of Pigs, but even after that, sort of operating against Cuban installations, Cuban citizens, and so on. And then, the CIA saying, oh, or the US administration saying, oh, but they have nothing to do with us. But then eventually you inevitably, establish strong links. A lot of these people are either, vets or former CIA agents, or, there are sort of incestuous links often between these private security corporations and the state actors fundamentally. And we're seeing in this case again, these links exist. To what extent they acted with the permission or even the encouragement of the US administration remains unclear. I have my suspicion. I suspect that if they were more successful, maybe the Trump administration would have said, well, we knew all along. That's the game that is played usually in these cases.
Mike Pompeo said at a briefing yesterday, hey, if it was us, would have gone much different.
That's right. Yeah. So, right. Absolutely. I mean, I think right now, the U.S. administration has made it clear that, it's looking for regime change pretty much through any means possible. All options are on the table, which is the language that's being used. So if all options are on the table, then surely this is one of them, right? So again, I can't make specific accusations yet, right. But I'm very concerned that over the coming months, particularly as we get closer to the elections in the United States, particularly if the Trump administration slides in the polls, and if Trump slides in the polls in terms of his numbers coming November, I'm very concerned about a potential escalation with regards to Venezuela, even military intervention of some kind of or another in Venezuela. And I think it would be obviously tragic because it would be violent. It would imply the loss of lives, an important loss of lives. And I think it would be a major misjudgment on behalf of this administration if they do that. We're hearing a lot of noise comparing this to Panama, in the late 80s. It's not, Venezuela is not Panama. Right? And Panama, when Bush Sr. Invaded in December 1989, had 2.5 million inhabitants, right? It has 4 million inhabitants now. It had 2.5 million inhabitants then. Venezuela's got 28 million inhabitants. That's larger than what Iraq had in 2003, right? So I think those numbers are important. And also, a lot of people hate Maduro in Venezuela, but a lot of people love Maduro in Venezuela. Right? It's a very polarized society. It's a very politicized society. It's a country that's been preparing for this kind of intervention now for years. both at the military level, but also at the militia level. This would be a huge quagmire for the United States, a big deal, a big problem, and it would be a tragedy for Venezuela, for Latin America, as well as a broken taboo, because there's never been a U.S. direct military intervention in South America. There have been plenty of U.S. military interventions in Central America and the Caribbean, but there's never been one in South America. And that's for a reason, right? There are larger countries with larger populations, further away from the immediate backyard, as it used to be known, as it's still unfortunately known in some quarters. So anyway, sorry for that long.
No, that's really important. No, because
it's a major source of concern. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really important. So that, again, the moral calculus of Grenada or Panama is obvious in terms of just the imperialist behavior, the loss of civilian life, the geopolitical implications. And then from just a military standpoint, sure, you can do that. You can be a bully in that sense. Venezuela logistically and materially would be a completely different thing. In terms of just the consequence of actually doing that. That's really important for people to know, that it's first and foremost, of course, a moral objection, but that this wouldn't be something that, oh, they shouldn't do that. That's too bad. This would have immediate and very serious consequences, across the region. That's our region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are ethical sort of dimensions to this. I don't think the United States should be imposing these sanctions on Venezuela. It shouldn't be strangling Venezuelan economy and the Venezuelan social reality the way it's doing. It's doing a lot of harm. It's killing tens of thousands of people. There's several serious studies, including one from the center that I work for, Center for Economic and Policy Research, that demonstrates that this is having these dire effects on the Venezuelan population. And certainly, if it escalates this further into a military territory, then it's going to be. There's already a crisis with Venezuelan migration in the region. It would make this crisis much bigger. You would be looking at sort of, I don't know, I don't like these comparisons, but sort of Syria style, on that kind of scale in terms of refugees. It would be very harmful for neighboring countries, and it would create war economies on the borders with Venezuela for the neighboring countries as well. So, ethically, in terms of human suffering and in terms of the illegitimacy, I would say, of such a sort of an imperial operation, then there are massive issues. But if you look at it even from the standpoint of empire and from the United States, I think it would be a huge strategic mistake. Venezuela is not Panama, as you just said. It's certainly not Grenada. That's an even more extreme example. It has an even smaller population. And if you look at Venezuela over the last few years, all the coup attempts that have been very much encouraged by the United States and the US administration, politically, but probably also with significant logistical support, they've failed. And
can you take us through a history, a kind of just a brief primer on just how many coup attempts, or give us a real sense of that, because the Venezuelan government is very resilient to these.
That's right. I think that's the key word. It's very resilient, and the more you have coups, the more you have coup attempts, the more resilient it becomes. But it's obvious, it's kind of like a vaccine against the next coup, right? Because every time there's a coup attempt, people have to show their true colors and their true cards, right? So every time a faction of the military rebels against the Venezuelan government, that faction of the military is not going to rebel again, right? That's it. It's isolated. You can only attempt a coup once if you're a military officer, right? So last year, 2019 was the year of the multiple coup attempts. And you'll remember from essentially a year ago, a little bit before, from February onwards, it was perceived that this was the moment to do this. There was this big attempt to get humanitarian aid through Cucuta, and this big concert, and the roads to Venezuela were all cut off. This kind of, it was actually fake aid, essentially, and kind of laughable quantities of aid, even if you consider the aid to have been genuine, it was like $25 million compared to the billions and billions of costs for the Venezuelan economy in terms of the cost of the sanctions, of the economic sanctions. It was quite hypocritical. I bring aid, tiny amount of aid with my right hand, but with my left hand, I'm, strangling the Venezuelan economy. And it's when all these key political actors sort of gambled that the time was ripe and it looked like the Venezuelan government might fall. So all sorts of actors, from pop stars to senators, people like Marco Rubio, but also the Secretary General of the OAS, they all went to the border. Several Latin American presidents went to the border. And this started a wave, I would say, an ongoing coup attempt that lasted several months. So there were several peaks to that, but essentially, a coup attempt that lasted. I mean, the last one was when Leopoldo López, actually one of the sort of radical opposition figures from a minority party, from Guaido's party, supposedly Guaido's boss, actually, because he's the head of the party, tried to organize a coup and eventually ended up in hiding in the Spanish embassy. And so this exhausted from the perspective of the Venezuelan opposition and some of its military allied, a lot of the possibilities from their point of view of toppling the Maduro government. And it was actually quite remarkable. For a while, Guaido was sort of, so the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, was sort of, I would say, neutralized in his capacity to do anything. And then the Venezuelan government has kind of decided to let him operate, which again is quite singular because,
right.
When you have if this is a dictatorship, then why are they letting this person calling himself a president and openly calling for the demise of the regime and calling for coups to happen, to operate within Venezuela.
And travel internationally. I mean, go get a standing ovation at the State of the Union, meet with leaders in Europe, meet with Justin Trudeau. I mean, that doesn't, again, it's not, I think we're complexifying Venezuela like any other government. Of course, there's problems, but the idea that this is, I mean, forget quote unquote dictatorships. I mean, you couldn't do this in the United States. This is a very rare behavior to be lenient about.
It's a very, very strange situation. I mean, it's a complete, hybrid situation in Venezuela. And the Venezuelan government has made the political choice to let Guaido operate. Obviously, he cannot do much because he doesn't exert any sovereignty. I mean, this is, again, we could go I mean, Guaido has achieved a lot internationally, relatively speaking, but very little domestically. So internationally, I mean, it's unbelievable. But at the Organization of American States, it's Guaido's representative who sits where Venezuela, who represents the state of Venezuela. Whereas at the UN, a few hundred kilometers north of Washington in New York, it's the Maduro government that has its representative at the United Nations. Why? Because the UN, as the guardian of international law, knows that in order to be the representative of your government at the United Nations, you have to exert de facto sovereignty. Right? It doesn't matter what kind of regime you have. I mean, it might matter for all sorts of other things. So you might get attacked on the human rights record. But in terms of who is represented at the United Nations, you have to exert sovereignty, real sovereignty, de facto sovereignty. So control of territory, control of institutions, control of the armed forces, control of the police, control of the country, right? And we all know that Maduro controls the country, whereas Guaido doesn't. But at the Organization of American States, which is a less rigorous organization, very politicized, very sort of hawkish, serving fundamentally the interests of the United States, it is Guaido's representative that who sits there. So it's
Can you talk more about the OAS? I think this is important to spend a few minutes on, and maybe you can also remind us of the work you did with Center for Economic and Policy Research right out of the gate. I mean, it was very clear, obviously, that it was a coup in Bolivia, but the OAS has historical ties to the United States, obviously, but potentially, I've heard some people, obviously historical ties, but that more recently, they've gotten even tighter with the U.S. in terms of some of this kind of renewed aggression in Latin America. But maybe, can you just speak specifically to the OAS role here in more general terms?
Yeah, so the Organization of American States, OAS, which is actually physically located a few hundred meters away across the lawn from the White House in a very pretty prestigious building that was donated by the great, I've forgotten his name, the great Carnegie, is it? The
Carnegie, sure. Yeah, that sounds
so.
right.
I'd have to check. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
a great marble.
Sounds plausible. Yeah.
A great marble building just across from the White House was from its very conception in 1948, essentially an organization that was meant to keep the Western Hemisphere united in the Cold War. Right. So that was the prime role of the OAS during the Cold War, and as soon as the Cold War was over, the OAS really essentially sort of struggled to identify its new role in the international system. So when Cuba turned communist, in inverted commas, 1962, Cuba was chucked out because, and this is actually literally what the resolution said, the inter-American system was incompatible with Marxism-Leninism. So out you go, right? But when all these terrible dictatorships emerged in Latin America, military dictatorships, mostly in the 1960s and 70s, that was fine, right? So it wasn't based on democracy, on human rights, on all these kind of values. It was based on the fight against communism. Now, when the Cold War came to an end, the OAS really tried to go back to trying to having this kind of democratic legitimacy, right? So it wasn't hampered by this fight against communism anymore. So it really tried to be the sort of an organization that would defend the values of democratic capitalism, right? Except it had a very poor legacy. And so it really struggled to do that. Essentially, it succeeded in doing a small part of that by establishing strong institutions that would monitor elections. So that was kind of its joker. And the OAS managed to become an expert at electoral monitoring, electoral observing, which it did fairly successfully. Technically, it became very well known globally for having sort of high standards at electoral observation. Now, eventually, in the 21st century, when a lot of Latin American government turned to the left, at one point you had, 2009, which was the apex of this. Depending on how you count these countries, you'd have between 12 and 14 Latin American governments were left of center, right? Some of them quite radically so. So that changed. For the first time in history, you had an OAS Secretary General elected in 2005 who wasn't supported by the United States. This had never happened before. Right. And this person was re-elected, José Miguel Insulza was re-elected in 2010 against the will of the United States once again. So, that didn't happen before. But then when the tide turned back to the right, so roughly 2014, 2015 in Latin America, this new Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, who had been elected actually with the support of the left in Latin America, sort of adapted to the new circumstances and became extremely pro-US and extremely hawkish. So you've got a return right now to this OAS playing the role that it was playing in the 60s and 70s, essentially a Cold War OAS. So trying to isolate Venezuela, trying to isolate Nicaragua, starting to fight against Cuba, when the OAS had essentially dropped that battle and in fact had invited Cuba back in 2009. Cuba said, no, we don't want back in the OAS. That was Cuba's decision. But in 2009, the OAS invited Cuba back to be a member of the organization. So, but you're seeing something which actually Secretary of State Pompeo celebrated in a February speech in the OAS, celebrating the return of the OAS to, I think I quote exactly, the good days of the 1950s and 1960s. Something very similar to that, right? So, right. It's the OAS of the Cold War, trying to isolate the left, trying to prevent the left from returning to power in certain countries, actually even prepared to, I would say, jeopardizing some of the institutions that it had constructed, such as the Department for Electoral Observation. So you've had the most, I mean, you'd already had an example with Haiti in 2010, 2011, where I think the OAS played a dirty role there. But, you know, this, the recent observation of the Bolivian elections last October was really anti-technical, really political, and eventually resulted in Evo Morales being toppled and having to go into exile. Why? Essentially because the process was politicized and they didn't do a technical job. They did a political job. They said there was, the OAS said there was fraud in Bolivia where there is clearly no evidence of such fraud. So to cut a long story short, I think we're seeing a return of the OAS playing the sort of pro-US, Fidel Castro used to call the OAS the US Ministry of its colonies, right? So, I mean, that's kind of become a bit of a slogan in the Latin American left, but certainly playing the Monroeist card, right? So, try and play the institution that helps the US administer its backyard, essentially.
So, connect this with this concept of lawfare. Which people certainly would, from the coverage I've done and my perception of the situation in Brazil and the prosecution of President Lula, that these sort of, particularly, I mean, Lava Jato in Brazil, but actually across Latin America, these sprawling anti-corruption investigations, which, first of all, they do tend to start broad, but then target the left. And then at times, maybe they conflate, corruption is such a big all-encompassing word that it confuses, but when people hear it, I think they think, oh, okay, corruption, that means that somebody took, a health budget and washed it through a Swiss bank to, put in real estate investments or something. But what it might mean is somebody, just like in DC or anywhere else, political horse trading, working with the political realities of, your given situation so you can govern. And, I say that all to say that I'd like you to maybe speak on the broader themes of that, but a case that we have not covered a lot, but I know is close to you because you served in his government, is a recent conviction in absentia. I mean, Rafael Correa is not in Ecuador for this. But charges against him by the current Lenin Moreno government. And I guess I'm wondering, first of all, your sense of this lawfare role in terms of targeting the left in Latin America. And does the Correa case connect with that, or is that sort of on a different track? And what do you think of the merits of that case?
Yeah, sure. I think it completely is. I mean, it's one of the archetypal examples of the lawfare you've just described. Right, so going back to the coups of the 1960s and 1970s, it's probably not the preferred route to getting rid of the left, because the world has changed since 1967, 70. It would look bad, and so there have been all sorts of different strategies in order to try and prevent the Latin American left from returning to power. And, I think for the United States establishment and for the State Department, it was probably quite traumatic, and maybe it's a strong term, but maybe not, to have a majority of Latin American countries, depending on, obviously each country has different dates, but, by and large, between 2000 and 2015, it was tough for US imperialism in Latin America. Right? I mean, you had a lot of countries trying to establish sovereign institutions, sovereign states, and then sovereign, even regional institutions, creating alternatives to the OAS, not really playing the neoliberal game, not wanting the IMF in, not really wanting the World Bank in. Obviously, it'll depend from one country to the other, but by and large, this was not, and bringing China in as well as an important partner, diversifying relations. being very critical of the United States in multilateral fora. These were not good times for U.S. Domination in its backyard. And they wait, the United States essentially waited in different contexts. They had different strategies to try and turn that page. In some cases, such as in Argentina, they found sort of poster boys of neoliberalism that they could support, like Macri. In other cases, they couldn't win electorally. So they even organized coups, in some cases. But, in every single example is going to be different. But certainly lawfare has been a way of making sure that the threats, so the Lulas and the Correas of this world, cannot be elected. I think Lula and Correa are perfect examples of this. Lula was essentially in jail, held on bogus charges in order for him not to be able to run, because all the polls confirmed that he would win, and he would have won easily against Bolsonaro. And Correa, very similarly, he's not been in jail, but he's been abroad. He didn't flee Ecuador. He was already abroad when the trouble started because his wife is Belgian. So he announced before his term came to an end that he would be living in Belgium once he left the presidency, and it's exactly what he did. A few days after handing over the presidency to his successor, he left to Belgium, and the sort of lawfare caught him already outside the country. And essentially, the purpose of that lawfare has been to prevent him from coming back. The problem is, of course, throughout Latin America, and that includes Ecuador, the return of neoliberalism is extremely unpopular. And you will recall that in 2019, last year, we saw a number of historic protests spread like wildfire throughout the region against essentially neoliberal reform, right? Neoliberal structural adjustment programs accompanied by the IMF. So you had them in Ecuador, the biggest protests in certainly in my lifetime, in my generation, but also in Chile, in Colombia, in Haiti, and a number of countries. In some countries where there were electoral outlets for people to express themselves politically, such as in Argentina, the left came back in, right? And if you look at the polls, certainly that's the case in Ecuador. Correa, if he was on the ticket tomorrow, he would win with a landslide. So they're very worried about that in Ecuador. We've got presidential and congressional, we call it National Assembly in Ecuador, but essentially congressional elections in February next year, so very soon. And Correa would be likely to win if he could run. So Moreno did two things. The current president of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, did two things in order to avoid Correa from coming back. The first thing was to reform the constitution and prevent re-election. So re-election is now banned in Ecuador, so Correa can't run. However, he could run as vice president, and that would obviously boost the ticket, whoever the presidential candidate would be. With Correa as vice president, that would obviously boost the ticket. Another alternative would be for Correa to run as a member of the National Assembly of Congress, right? And that would also sort of boost the party. Also, it probably boost the presidential, vice presidential ticket and mean that it would probably lead to a parliamentary majority, which would be very important, right? So they're stopping him from doing this. They've invented these bogus corruption charges. It's really incredible. I mean, can't go into too much detail, but one of the proofs against Correa is a notebook written by one of his advisors at the time, who claims that, so she's written all the amounts that were received for illegal campaign financing in this notebook, right? This is the mother of all proofs. And she originally said, well, the notebook is dated 2014. Today, I have received such and such, I've received so many thousands of dollars, and it's all down to the common sense and everything. And then the next day, today I've received so many from so-and-so. And she claimed originally that this was with presidential knowledge. So the Correa knew about this. But then it was proven that the notebook, written supposedly in 2014, came out of the press in 2018. So she changed the story, said, oh no, I remembered this and I wrote it on a flight one day from Quito, a 45-minute flight.
Oh, wait, I'm saying you mean literally like the press that physically makes the notebooks?
The notebook.
Okay, just so people are clear. It wasn't released to the press in 2018.
Oh, no, sorry.
The physical object was not produced till 4 years later. Okay, yeah,
that's
go ahead.
Correct.
Okay.
So she had to change the story and said she'd written all this, from memory, but down to the exact cent, the exact person. At 10 o'clock this morning, they came, they deposited.
Probably not.
So it's a whole shambles. But the order to the judges, who are under strict control here by the government, is not to let Correa go. Now there's an appeals process which they're speeding up illegally, because if by mid-September of this year is when people will register their candidacies for the February elections. And if they don't have a final guilty verdict against Correa by September, as in many parts of the world, once you've enrolled as a candidate, you're immune from prosecution, right? Until the elections are over. Otherwise, people would be persecuted left, right, and center in order to stop them from running. So from September onwards, they need a guilty sentence before September so they can block Correa from participating. So there's already a verdict, if you like, 8 years in prison and 25 years taking away his political rights, which blocks him from running in any election. But that verdict can still be appealed, right? And until the appeals process is concluded, Correa could still technically be a candidate. So they're essentially rushing things. So it was amazing because under this COVID-19 crisis, the whole judiciary is closed down unless these extremely urgent matters, people who are in jail unjustly, you can appeal and you'll be heard. But all the non-urgent matters have been sort of delayed. But this was not. The court case against Correa was, everybody wore their masks and went to court. And so this is a typical case of lawfare in order to stop essentially democracy, right? It's an anti-democratic case of lawfare. Yeah.
Spend just, I want to, actually, before I want to get to China and Latin America, but just briefly, can you explain Lenin Moreno? Because this is an important character in the sense that he wasn't the party from the right that won. He actually was supposedly sort of going to carry on the Correa legacy, and he's reversed very aggressively. I mean, everything from the aiding in the political persecution of Julian Assange, which has implications for freedom of the press across the Western system, to a total reversal, if my understanding is correct, on the real social gains that were made in Ecuador under the Correa government. So what is the Moreno? And Lenin is not a mistake. He was named after Lenin. What happened?
It's actually not such an uncommon name in Ecuador, Lenin.
Oh, really? I thought he was actually named after the guy. No?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm sure. That's
okay, but it's not. But a lot of people are doing this. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Quite common. So I wish I could explain it fully. I mean, obviously, been thinking about this for the last 3 years because it's been a major setback for Ecuador's political process. But essentially, Lenin is the archetypal historic sort of traitor, and there are a few throughout history. You can think of a few of them. A Shakespearean traitor, right? So his Trojan horse, who was elected, he had been Correa's vice president, right, until 2013, sorry, and was Correa's handpicked successor, or the party's handpicked successor. He was elected. He won the elections. And from the moment he was elected, from the moment he was sworn in, he started this 180-degree U-turn against Correa's policies, so including the economic and social policies, bringing back sort of neoliberal policies, deregulation, cutting back the role of the state, cutting back funding for social and for health and education. So one of the consequences, obviously, the COVID-19 crisis in Ecuador, because it's cut back massively the health sector, but also geopolitically. So sort of becoming really aligned with the Trump administration, going back to bilateralism, killing all of our initiatives in terms of Latin American integration. Ecuador was the seat of UNASUR, sort of the Brussels of this new South American Union, which was a very important project, one of our most important projects, on all sorts of levels, on development, on economics, but also geopolitically, in order to have more independence from the United States, and also more independence from anybody, to sort of interact as a sovereign bloc of states in the international system. Well, Ecuador got rid of not only its membership, but obviously it's the fact that it was the seat of this organization, which actually was also going to be very interesting for Ecuador in terms of its strategic integration in South America. Becoming the Brussels of South America is not necessarily a bad thing if you're a small country like Ecuador, right? Anyway, so you've already mentioned Assange. There's now a runway in the Galapagos Islands, which is extremely symbolic for Ecuador, because the Galapagos Islands is like one of the gems of, Ecuadorian nationhood, if you like. And one of the runways is now being handed over basically to the, it's being used certainly by the US military, which is a big taboo, especially since the US had its biggest military base in South America was based in Ecuador until 2009, until Correa put an end to that. So that brings back sort of ghosts of the past, right? So all sorts, whichever sort of domain of public policy and, you look at, there's been a massive U-turn. And because Correa is still the biggest threat to that, because Correísmo as a political phenomenon and the Correa's political party, they've actually managed to take away the political party from Correa, but the movement still exists and would be the likely winner of next year's election. A lot of what Moreno's done is to persecute the followers of Rafael Correa and some of his closest collaborators. So a lot of people have had to flee into exile, including, elected members of parliament, Congress, right? Yeah. So a number of them have fled. And there was I don't know if you remember, the last year there was a whole ordeal with a number of Congress, members of Congress having to hide in the Mexican embassy, and then Mexico negotiating with Ecuador so that Ecuador could grant safe passage so that these people could actually go into asylum to Mexico. This eventually happened. Then you had elected officials from Correa's party, the equivalent of the governor of the state where the capital is in Ecuador. So it's a province called Pichincha, where Quito, the capital, is. So the governor of that state was arrested because she had supported supposedly the October protests. So they arrested her, like in the old days of the 60s and 70s, like they arrested her on rebellion, sort of like sedition, right? I mean, this is going back to the language of the persecutions against the left in the 60s and 70s. Really scary stuff, right? So that's sliding more and more into authoritarianism, essentially. And here there's a great contradiction, because Lenin Moreno has been trying to portray Correa as this terrible dictator, and that he really means a return to this kind of patrician form of democracy, right? The democracy of the elites, the liberal pact of the elites. But on the other hand, in order to be able to do this so-called democratization, which I would seriously question, he's had to be more and more authoritarian, because if he allows democracy to prosper, Correísmo would triumph. So this has been the situation, the cul-de-sac that Moreno has been in. And now on popularity or approval ratings, I mean, this was before the COVID-19 crisis, the latest polls, he was on 12%. So he's probably, he's probably even lower than that. And in Ecuador, we also measure credibility. So the question is, do you believe what the president says? And we've been doing it for 40 years or so. So it's interesting to see that evolve through time. And 7% of Ecuadorians believe what Moreno says. So he's probably the least believed, the least credible president since restoration of democracy in Ecuador after military rule in 1979. So that's how bad the situation is in Ecuador. Yeah.
So when you talk about China, you alluded to China earlier, and I've actually said in a way that I think people have misinterpreted that Chinese influence in Latin America is a good thing, not because I have some type of naive view of China or an idealized view of China. A lot of people actually sort of complain on the other side of the equation when I criticize things about China. But that the point is that allowing for multipolarity in Latin America and the Caribbean gives more of a capacity for a Correa government, as an example, to choose its own way, because there isn't one hegemonic presence sort of dominating everything. So what was that your sort of understanding of the importance, among other things, of cultivating a relationship with China? Was just the idea that if Latin America is going to be genuinely independent and follow its own development path, it needs to broaden out its relationships with essentially places with a lot of capital and a lot of room to invest.
Yes, I think that, I mean, essentially the point you've made is correct. I mean, not having all your eggs in the same baskets, we say in Ecuador. Right. So, you know, in terms of your foreign policy, in terms of your alliances, is really important. And breaking that sort of historic dependency with the United States. I mean, we always told, I mean, when I was foreign minister, we always told the United States, we want a great relationship with the United States. And lots of things we admire about the United States. And in fact, there were even some things that we, in our policies, that we thought, oh, look, that's how they did it in the United States. That worked. Maybe we can replicate this. You know, there was no sort of visceral anti-Americanism. Before I was foreign minister, I worked in the higher education system. I was minister for a while there, and there were lots of things about the US universities. Some things we didn't replicate because we didn't agree with, but others we did. You know, there was no, and in fact, we tried to create lots of scientific partnerships with US universities because we wanted to develop a lot of sort of scientific research agendas, including with the biogenetics of the Amazon basin. Lots, I mean, you know, there was really, the United States was one of the countries I visited the most. You know, it was no visceral anti-Americanism. But clearly, there's a problem with the relationship with the United States, and that is the US security doctrine, I mean, essentially going back to the early 19th century, which is the Western Hemisphere for the United States, right? And the Western Hemisphere as a backyard. In the Monroe Doctrine in the early days, 1823, right, James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine was maybe it could be interpreted as an anti-colonial doctrine, right? So America's for the Americans. Well, what does that mean? Is it America's for the Americans as in we're all Americans in the Americas, or Americans for the United States Americans, right? And over time, the Monroe Doctrine became more and more Americans for the North Americans, right? So it was used to prevent any other region of the world from interacting with Latin America. So certainly during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and more recently with China. And clearly, Latin Americans should be allowed to trade with everyone, to have ties with everyone. So to bring China on board was really, really important in that sense, because, you know, we could tell, this is how much our products are worth, you know, instead of sending them to, I mean, just to give you an example, in the mid-1990s, Ecuador probably exported, in the early 90s, Ecuador exported 85% of its exports went to the United States. Now it's more like 35%, right? Still very important, and it's a key trading partner, but that dependency has, you know, there's been a great diversification, and that is good for Ecuador, and that is good for Latin America. So, I mean, that was probably the key thinking. Also in terms of liquidity, right? China has a lot of liquidity. In fact, over the recent years, it's had more liquidity than the United States. So that was key in terms of, you know, developing certain areas of our economy, getting joint ventures, but also loans, but also for economic reasons, it was very interesting. The other thing which I think is important is that China imposes less conditionalities in every single sense of the word. So I'm not saying China is an innocent bystander in the international system. And China has its interests, and it sometimes pushes them, you know, insistently. And, you know, I'm not trying to romanticize China here, but certainly in its relations with it doesn't have this kind of what the French used to call mission civilisatrice, right? So to try and impose a political system or a vision of the world, whereas the United States still does, right? So, you know, if you're a leftist leader in Ecuador, you might be the best leader in history, but you're not gonna be received in the White House, right? But the moment you get some right-wing dictator or someone like Lenin Moreno comes in, then it's red carpet, right? China doesn't think like that. Right? China tries to, so that is also something which is important, right? It's there's more respect for the political system of the other, for the sovereignty of the other, for the institutions of the other. In the United States, it's if you're not with me, then I'm going to fight you and I'm going to try and overthrow you and I'm going to try and regime change is a real constant of US foreign policy. Now, there is some caution to be exerted with China too. China is still fundamentally interested in the same things as the United States, as a matter of fact, as the European Union, in terms of its trading relationship with countries from the global periphery, from the global south. So it's still looking for raw materials. And so for Latin American countries, and certainly that was our mission, who are trying to change their role in international division of labor, if you like, trying to move away from just exporting raw materials and importing everything else, who are trying to diversify their economy. And sometimes that will mean applying also protectionist policies in order to develop vulnerable industries or to develop certain sectors without, products from the United States or China or elsewhere just killing that possibility because they're cheaper or more competitive. That sometimes requires also some approach to China. I mean, China today is quite happy signing some free trade agreements with rather similar clauses than the United States would impose, right? So those kinds of things, there you can have an approach where you say, well, China, we're interested in this, but we're not interested in that. And, you don't have to just, be 100% on board with everything China says or sign everything China proposes. And that's certainly not what we did. And in fact, we tried constantly to engage the Chinese in terms of investing in areas of our economy that were not based on the export of raw materials. China bought some of our oil, and that was probably some of the stuff that interested China, more. But in exchange, we said, okay, we'll sell you some oil, but please come and invest in this scientific project, or come and invest in this and that. So, there's no perfect solution, and I don't believe in alignment, wholesale alignment in either China or the United States. As a peripheral state, you've got to try and build your own policies. You've got to use different international actors in a way that is most convenient, most strategic, and most intelligent for you. But certainly, China has been more respectful, I would say, of institutions, political systems, and sovereignty of countries like Ecuador than the United States has been, without a doubt. Because the United States still has this doctrine that it has two great oceans that protect it in terms of its security, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Oceans. And that's its max, and it's great. It gives it a lot of security. It even gives it times, like physical minutes before, in order to stop an aggression, a missile or whatever. Right. But that condition only works if the Western Hemisphere is literally pacified. And unfortunately, pacification has not been through always the tools of consensus and respect and mutual recognition, and sometimes literally through kind of bully tactics of I will be your boss, and that is going to work less and less in this century with other actors on board, such as China, but also others. And I think that this is a parenthesis we're living now with this lawfare we were talking about and this kind of return of a very aggressive neoliberal right. But by and large, what we saw in the first decade and a half of the 21st century is more likely to be the norm in the 21st century for Latin America than the exception, because it's in Latin America's interest to diversify its tie and not be sort of under the control or domination of the US hegemon.
That's a really inspiring note to leave on. And I just want to ask you one more question that is, actually, I was going to say it's short, but this is a complex question, but maybe just briefly speak to, as Latin America develops this strategy and hopefully returns to the pink tide in terms of independence and developing a left project, what role does protecting ecology or environmental strategy play in that as well?
Yeah, so that actually ties in with your previous question, because China's sometimes been accused of just wanting raw materials, and not caring too much about the ecology. That's kind of a line that's been pushed as well by the US, but I can assure you quite a lot of US multinationals, transnational corporations have not cared at all about the ecology.
Really? Chevron wasn't contributing to the Ecuadorian well-being of the Ecuadorian?
I was just about to say that. The biggest ecological, environmental disaster in Ecuador was a US corporation, not Chinese corporation, right? But yeah, I mean, I think in the process of wanting cheap raw materials, whether these be minerals, but also agriculture. I mean, one of the biggest, we talk a lot about oil and mining. Certainly, I think mining poses a challenge, but actually the biggest threat to the Amazon rainforest right now is the expansion of the agricultural frontier, right? And it's really aggressive, and I've seen it a lot flying on helicopters of the Amazon and stuff when I was, in government. You can see how much, and an oil well is not very pretty. There's a hole in the jungle, the size of a soccer field, if you like, with a little flame coming out from the oil well, and it's not pretty, but it's nowhere comparable to the African palm oil plantations, right? Going all the way up to the horizon. You can't see the end of them. These palm trees, monoculture that have been they're growing where you used to have pristine rainforest, right? And so that is a major challenge. I think it has to be part of the leftist project in Latin America. I think it was in some parts, but I think it needs to be more so. There were so many urgent social needs, and there was so much need for infrastructure, for basic infrastructure, some basic, elementary growth, and some basic elementary electricity, and some basic road network, and some basic schools and hospitals and things like that, made out of concrete, that we needed to build for our people. That maybe the environmental discourse was not top of the agenda, but a bit too far down in the 10 points, and our 10 key points, and that needs to be back at the forefront. And I think, I think that's the kinds of things that need to be at the top of the agenda of the left in Latin America, which is one of the most environmentally diverse regions in the world. And I actually think that exploiting our environment in a sustainable way is key to changing our role in the international division of labor. So, for example, exploiting the Amazon, not what is underneath the ground, but what is above the ground, without cutting it down, which is exploiting the biogenetic patrimony, the heritage there of the Amazon, in terms
of like pharmaceutical innovation,
exactly,
like that.
For biotech, for pharmaceutical, for all sorts of things, is part of the great qualitative shift to a new kind of knowledge economy that Latin America needs to engineer, and that has to be a key proposition of the left.
And along with that, maybe also some different agreements around protecting commons and making sure intellectual property doesn't develop in such a way that it excludes the periphery from medical innovation.
So fighting for public goods in the commons, absolutely. Right. And intellectual property is going to be the big struggle of the 21st century, even more than trade. Right. It's clear that intellectual property is the new thing. I mean, it's the big thing we were facing as well, with a lot of piracy in the Amazon, biopiracy. And, if we don't protect, or if we don't fight, I mean, it's probably a lot of it is too late, because a lot of the species now have been identified and are being, but if we don't fight in multilateral fora for these species and these molecules and these properties to be for the service of our development and the development of our peoples, then it's gonna be a new wave of colonial accumulation of capital, right? I mean, so that's absolutely where the fight is at, and it's entirely compatible with a pro-environment worldview, which protects the planet from climate change and all these things. So I think that is the new. I mean, it was already actually a part of our political process, but there were so many other basic elementary things that had to do with redistribution that had to be done, that it wasn't always as visible. And I think it certainly has to be the priority from now on. Yeah.
Oh, Guillaume Long, that's just really, really great. I really, really appreciate your time. Everybody, of course, there's links. You can follow Guillaume on Twitter, follow his work at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which is actually does very good work on domestic economics. And you could read Dean Baker there, but it's the indispensable place in DC for following U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policy in Latin America. So, Guillaume, really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on your show.
Thanks so much. Take care. All right, guys, are we, I don't know if we're clear. I guess we're not clear. There's no breaks until the big break, right?
No breaks till the big break.
No breaks till the big break. Connectivity seems pretty good.
Oh, yeah. This from the cloud, not relying on us. So if one of us goes down, it stays up.
Wow. FNA. All right. Become a member of the Majority Report today. Majority.fm/become a member. Subscribe on YouTube. Check out justcoffee.coop. Fair trade tea, coffee, or chocolate. On Tuesday, on the Michael Brooks Show, we interviewed Toure F. Reed, who has a great book called Towards Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. This is a really, really brilliant history of Black labor organizing, the New Deal, the Great Society, and then everything basically from Reaganism through Obama. Then Doris Polo and I talked about U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean, CARICOM nations trying to, right now, even with this U.S. aggression against Venezuela, and even as the United States is literally stealing, the Trump administration is stealing COVID-19 testing kits and ventilators that are headed to Jamaica, Barbados, Grenada. It's extraordinary. And so we've talked about the leadership of an example of Mia Mottley, who's she's an incredibly impressive Prime Minister of Barbados. Tonight, Daniel Bester and I are live streaming on why we cannot have a new Cold War with China. And we're doing a kind of physical infrastructure of US-based presence and military presence across the world. And there's just a ton of work there. Catch up with the interviews with Cornel West and Adolph Reed. Patreon.com/TMBS. And of course, Michael Brooks Show on YouTube, where, 3 clips a day, tons of live streams, lots of stuff going on. So check it all out. And you can go to Red Emma's and buy Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right, and then go write a 5-star review of it on Amazon. Jamie, what's up?
Oh, hello.
Hello.
How's everybody doing?
Good. You're a little bit quiet.
Yeah, I can't hear her too well.
Should I turn myself up a little bit? How about like that?
That's
better.
That's better, yeah.
Better?
Better. There you go.
All right. Excellent. It's live television, folks. So this week on the Antifada, this episode came out yesterday, and I'm very excited about it. We had on the super smart Marxist Assad Hader. We already had on his brother Shujo. We're just working our way through the Hader family, I guess. We talked about so many things. We did a little Bernie postmortem from a Marxist perspective using the lens of depoliticization, which I think is a really interesting lens that he wrote about in Viewpoint magazine. We talked about mass politics versus subculture politics and the problems with that framework of looking at things, the necessity of abolishing markets, the party question, and our favorite thing besides communism, punk rock. So check that out, folks. Patreon.com/theantifada. Also, I'm very excited to announce later today, Andy and I will be moderating a panel on coronavirus and the future of work for Red May Seattle. Obviously, we're not in Seattle right now, but we're doing it virtually, and that is at 9 p.m. Eastern. I screwed up the time before because they are on the West Coast. So it's at 6 p.m. West Coast time, 9 p.m. East Coast time. And I'm very, very excited to talk with these people about some of the things that they've written. Magali Miranda wrote a great piece about domestic laborers and their struggle to organize for their rights. Annie McClanahan wrote something about the future of logistics. And Aaron Banana wrote about automation and kind of wrote a critique of the left UBI as like non-reformist reform, or the capitalist road to communism, that I think is very compelling and sidesteps a lot of the vulgar workerism that we've seen from other critiques. So I'm very excited and kind of nervous to talk to these people at 9 p.m. tonight. And I'll put a link in the blog post.
Yeah, literary hangover last night. I finished my playthrough of Half-Life 2 while listening to 1984. And it was like sort of the dark side of the moon. What's that combination of dark side of the moon?
Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz, yeah, they synced up together. The climaxes of both the book and the game happened basically at the same time, which I wasn't expecting. So I wrapped both of those up. So I'm going to be doing future playthroughs like that. All sorts of books, probably listen to some Karl Kautsky on communism in Central Europe while I play Kingdom Come Deliverance. So twitch.tv/literary hangover folks, subscribe to me there.
Oh, I'm sorry, guys. One other thing real quick. At 3 o'clock, so in a little over an hour and a half, DM25, which is basically Democracy in Europe TV, which is their YouTube channel. I'm going to be on a panel with David Adler, Grace Blakely, and Shreko Horvat, and I'm looking forward to that. That'll be fun. So go over there and, in general, subscribe. That's another one of these, very good channels with a European twist. All right, folks, we'll see you in the fun half.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude. You want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 238 56 27 1/2 5 8s 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Ooh.
Rand Paul. I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agreed.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up.
Ooh.
Wow.
But
Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up.
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
So ridiculous. I want to just do this this Brazil clip up top, just to sort of. I mean, we that was a really good interview with Guillaume Long. I'd recommend everybody check him out in general, and definitely Center for Policy Research. But we know that this firm, Silvercore, this was the mercenary firm that was attempting. I don't want to trivialize this, but I did find the phrase "Bay of Chuds" to be funny. This scheme in Venezuela. Look, this guy's in custody in Venezuela, but he is saying that the deal was inked with Juan Guaido. They were coming out of Colombia. The United States, as Guillaume was saying, Pompeo was saying, essentially saying, we have an idea of who funded this. And also, well, we weren't involved with this, because obviously if we were involved with this, this would have happened. So essentially using the denial to issue another threat. Now, Brazil Wire and Natalia Urban, who is a very good journalist who also contributes to Brazil Wire. And obviously I do a lot with Brian Mayer, and I also interviewed along with Danny Hunt and Brian. We interviewed Lula together. Natalia has this excellent new report in Brazil Wire just documenting that this same mercenary firm was present on the ground in Brazil during the 2018 election, which of course saw the political imprisonment of Lula, which took him off the ballot, and the election of Jair Bolsonaro, the extremist president of Brazil. This is clip number 7. This is Brian Mayer talking about the reporting on Brazil Wire, explaining it to Telesur. And this is another very important aspect we need to track. As Guillaume pointed out, the role of these mercenary firms is international. They're aggressively used in Africa, and they are great technical, plausible deniability for regime change and coup d'etat attempts, like we just saw in the last couple of days in Venezuela. This is Brian Mayer on Telesur.
Brazilian outlet Brazil Wire has reported that Silvercorp USA, the U.S. security company behind this failed operation against the Venezuelan government, was present in Brazil during the 2018 elections. Our correspondent Brian Mayer explains.
A breaking story published in Brazil Wire, the English-language news portal about Brazil, by journalist Natalia Urban, shows that Silvercorp USA, the mercenary company that has ties to the Donald Trump administration, which was hired by Juan Guaido to engage in the failed coup d'etat attempt that happened yesterday in Venezuela, was operating in Brazil during the 2018 presidential elections, which saw the rise of right-wing extremist Jair Bolsonaro in the most tumultuous election in Brazilian history. After the leading candidate, who was polling at double the support of anyone else in the race, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, was removed from the election on frivolous corruption charges with no material evidence. Now, at the time of the elections, there were over 50 violent attacks committed across the country by Bolsonaro supporters, including several murders. According to social media postings on Instagram that were subsequently erased, Silvercorp executives claim that they were leaving Brazil after an unspecified amount of time, 11 days after the first round election. So the question is, what were they doing in Brazil? What were they working on, and who hired them?
Those indeed are the questions. And in general, we're going to need to look very, very closely at the role of these mercenary firms in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, everybody knows, Eric Prince is the most infamous example, and Blackwater was key in the Bush administration as a contractor in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, infamously in Iraq, there's the Nisour Square massacre, where Blackwater operatives opened fire on a crowd of Iraqi civilians. I mean, it was basically such a blatant case that they actually faced charges in the United States. And one can only imagine how blatant that is given the daily and routine brutal violation of and killings of Iraqis and Afghanis. But these firms operate, as Guillaume says, all over Africa. Eric Prince is definitely back at the center of power in the sense of connections to the Trump administration. There was a bizarre proposal that was rejected in the beginning of the Trump administration by the military. Essentially, Bannon and Prince were apparently interested in basically turning over the entire Afghan U.S. troop presence to mercenary contractors. So instead of just them being sort of support, it would essentially just be them as a private army. That was the reporting at the time. And also Eric Prince has definitely been seeking business as well in China and the Gulf. And we see this firm operating across Latin America, including in, again, the Brazilian process, which was not a classical coup, but the war against the Workers' Party and Lula and the process that brought Bolsonaro to power has to be understood as some form of hybrid war and some form of coup. Not in a traditional sense, but it was an illegitimate removal of Dilma. It was an illegitimate process against Lula. And Bolsonaro was somebody who, again, was also framed in the U.S. press as and the Western press as sort of coming out of nowhere. But I have reason to believe that he was not the first choice because he is crazy and he is an extremist and he makes for bad press. But I think that the interests that wanted a market agenda in Brazil knew that they needed a backup plan if the traditional right-wing parties weren't able to pull it together, and they weren't. And that backup plan was obviously Bolsonaro going up back a couple of years.
Yeah, I just like the idea of doing a coup on spec, right? Because we've all been independent contractors before. And the most garbage kind of independent contracting work is on spec, where you do the work. And if they like it, maybe you'll get paid. And it's like the Trumpiest thing ever to do foreign policy that way.
Yeah, I mean, the rates were not that high either.
I would also say that most of the times when you submit something on spec, you don't have encouragement to this extent by Nancy Pelosi.
Here this evening,
Looking at
a brave man
Pelosi stands up here,
who carries with him the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of all Venezuelans. Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Mr. President, please take this message back to your homeland.
Outrageous. It's outrageous.
I mean,
it's a complete. I mean, look, Bernie Sanders, I guess Gabbard, Ilhan Omar, Ro Khanna. There was a handful of people that even spoke out on this. I mean, this coup project is again more aggressive under Trump, no question. It's a bipartisan project. That's also no question. You have to be adults about this stuff.
What factoring directly into the equations of cowboys like this is the extent to which there's bipartisan support that if by some miracle they succeeded, they'd be kings right now. Like Pelosi would put a medal around those guys. So whatever, if it wasn't officially sanctioned, if there's no like Pentagon paper that says don't do this, that's not how this works anyway. Like
that's right.
If it works, then you take credit for it. If it doesn't work, like look at those clowns.
Exactly. I don't know them. Oh, he did security for me. Let's focus on first of all, we'll look at this Trump response to the nurses, and then we're going to highlight a protest that should be getting a significant amount of news attention. So we know that across the country, there's a problem with ventilators, with testing kits, with any number of things. Frontline and certainly people, working in grocery stores and so on, doctors and nurses have had to make makeshift equipment for themselves. There was, especially a couple of weeks ago, there was numerous stories of nurses tying scarves around their faces, as an example. This is a major problem. And we also know that nurses have been fired in retribution for speaking about these problems. And we also know that Donald Trump absolutely doesn't care if you die or if nurses die or if anyone dies, because all he cares about is press. And we also know that they are going to push this reopening. They're trying to reset the benchmark on acceptable levels of death. And a nurse bravely speaking out in New Orleans saying that there's PPE troubles is going to upset Donald Trump. Here he is with Donald Trump and Sophie Thomas, who is the nurse. This is incredible.
So PPE has been sporadic, but it's been manageable, and we do what we have to do. We're nurses, and we learn to adapt and do whatever the best thing that we can do for our patients to get the job done and get the care provided. And that's what we're going to continue to do as COVID-19 continues.
Sporadic for you, but not sporadic for a lot of other people.
Oh, no, I agree, Mr. President.
Because I've heard the opposite. I've heard that they are loaded up with gowns now. And, initially we had nothing. We had empty cupboards. We had empty shelves. We had nothing because it wasn't put there by the last administration. And I've heard that we have, I just saw it yesterday where they're making millions of masks a month in a factory from, in that case, it was Arizona. That's great. We have other factories being built now for masks. And for the most part, that was fine, but I've heard we have tremendous supply to almost all places.
Not sporadic.
Tremendous supply. To a point where we're going to start having some of our supply go to other countries, which need it very badly.
This guy is a delusional, disgusting brat. And he cannot even accept somebody on the front lines who's doing the job, who's saving. For every life that the Trump administration is costing through greed and incompetence, this woman is directly participating in saving. And it can't be one-to-one, obviously, because of the power differential. But this guy cannot, if he can throw a little controlled tantrum like that over a frontline responder who's saving people's lives, making the most mild, not even a criticism, just saying, hey, we need a little bit more of these resources. Of course, this is the same guy that's going to throw a tantrum when he has bad poll numbers, but this is somebody who is going to, as an example, shelve a CDC report on how to safely reopen the country because he's having daily fits because he can't brag about his economy anymore. This stuff was so leaned into by a certain sector of people that they missed basically doing political analysis because they just were personally fixated on Trump. And everybody, I think, understands why I think that's a foolish strategy and not effective in actually beating Trump, which in fact is incredibly important. If you balance it out and you don't fall for every, don't have a meltdown about every tweet, you're able to have an analysis of the actual policy set of the Republican Party and not just fixate on one person, reduce that noise by 80%, but still take 10, 20% to say, and, especially in an example like that this guy's just pathetic. That's just so fucking pathetic to have a little tantrum like that.
I'm honestly surprised he didn't attack her more as some sort of fake news crisis actor, or not crisis actor, right? Because everything's fine, but like a hater or whatever.
Yeah, if he finds out that she's like a Hillary supporter or did anything, he'll find a way to leak that to the press, I'm pretty sure.
Well, we don't even know. We're going to be hearing about this. It honestly reminds me, and I don't mean this to be trivial. I mean, really this guy's process of, 15, 20 years ago or something. There's a clip of Artie Lang roasting Trump at some event in Vegas. And it's funny. Artie has some very funny lines. And Trump does the thing. He definitely does the weird, handshake thing where he pulls Artie or whatever. But it's all like, you know, oh, that's very funny. You did a good job. Great. Several years later or a year later, but you know, an amount of time, he's on the Howard Stern show, and out of nowhere, Trump's just like, I don't like this guy, because Artie's the co-host, or you know, and he's just, this guy's a loser. He did the roast, totally disrespectful, low class. I mean, and this is back in like Donald Trump being part of the whack pack on Howard Stern, and he's not happy. I mean, he's, you know, and so, no, we don't, I agree with you, Jamie, but I think, you know, he had some sense of how to temperament, but he could, I mean, look, he could, the meltdown about this woman could still be coming on Twitter, you know. I mean, he'll, and I'm sure he's whining behind closed doors about it. And that is where, again, on a policy level, getting rid of pandemic preparedness, that's Republican policy. That was a John Bolton idea. Having completely collapsed public health infrastructure is a Republican and project that overlaps with much of the neoliberal project. All of those have to be at the forefront. And you cannot dismiss the equation of having a uniquely toxic, narcissistic individual in a situation like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's up, but we saw the video of the Wisconsin Supreme Court justice yesterday. Just
there you go.
Total like grade A lunatic, right? Like,
yes.
Saying making people stay at home is like Korematsu. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, these people are fucking damn.
They're all like, Trump is it's a weird balance to try to say, because Trump is totally gone, and then that's the entire bench that they got too, just completely lunatic.
Well, he's the perfect manifestation of the Republican Party. That's why anybody who knew anything should have known he would obviously win the 2016 primary. In addition to being a better performer and everything else.
Speaking of which, look what shirt I have on.
Let me see.
My Jeb Bush style and
poor old Jeb.
It's the Mark Halperin grades from the first debate.
Poor sad old Jeb.
Didn't turn out that way, folks.
Oh man, that was so intense.
That's so long ago, Jeb Bush.
Oh, according to the memes, he's gonna have a second life as some sort of Marxist-Leninist freedom fighter.
Yeah, his memes really did pop off for a bit.
So, do you remember the time where the guy was just at some like breakfast in Nashua or something, and the dude just cut him very rudely? Jeb was at some breakfast.
Oh yeah.
Breakfast
I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. He's like they're kicking me out the door. They're kicking, no, it was honestly, it was like, you can't let this guy have an extra 5 minutes. Nope. Strict time limits at the Lions Club or whatever it was. It was like he couldn't even
bingo.
He was so traumatized. He's so like, I don't know. Yeah.
You guys got a pancake breakfast? All right, I don't want to stand in the way.
Yeah, I don't want to stand in the way of anybody's pancake breakfast. Of course, there are a problem with equipment. There is a problem with equipment and protection for nurses across the board. I mean, not only just in hospitals, obviously, but I mean, you should hear the horrifying stories about nursing homes. And I have a friend whose parent works in a nursing home. It's terrifying across the board, in particular for nurses who can't even, how are they going to distance, in a job like that? So this is a protest that we should be backing very strongly. This is nurses from National Nurses United protesting and holding up 88 pairs of shoes for the 88 nurse deaths during the first couple of months of the pandemic.
They were committed to protecting others from the ravages of illness and being that voice, that advocate for their patients. But who was there protecting these nurses? How many of these nurses worked in the hospitals that were long on patients but short on N95 respirators? How many of these nurses were failed by chaotic and haphazard protocols, which left them vulnerable to exposure and illness? How many of these nurses die because this administration, this Congress, our elected officials, our government agencies failed to act, to lead, and to protect them. We stand here today, our hearts full of pain, but also with determination and demanding action. It is past time for this president and Congress to act.
Nothing to add to that. Let's hear a lot more and amplify those protests and all other organized labor. That's I mean, what they set up there in terms of observing the social distancing, but still taking the physical risk, which they take every day by the nature of their jobs. And the visual of that is extremely powerful, that they came out coordinated in terms of color, in terms of how they set it up. It's a really powerful demonstration, just even on a visual level. And of course, there's nothing from the White House. There's nothing from Trump, but having a little bit of a tantrum when a nurse points it out to him around him. And the leadership in Congress and across the board is a failed. I mean, we are functioning as a failed state when it comes to anything outside of propping up the banks and financial sector. I mean, this is, and partially that's by design. I mean, we've talked about this, that the Fed can get money and liquidity into the banking sector very easily, and to other, and to corporations that operate at scale. Even the Small Business Administration is not bureaucratically equipped to deliver resources in the way it needs to do to save small businesses. And that $1,200 is running out for folks. The, safeguards in terms of payroll running out. There's critical, nurses are under threat every single day. They do not have the equipment and protections they need. The testing kits are not there. And grocery store workers are dying, delivery people. I mean, this is all still happening. And the drumbeat to reopen, quote unquote, reopen, which is even taken in its own terms as delusional. It completely does not recognize the social reality, like people's changed behavior. Nouri al-Rabini, I really would recommend people listen to him on Bloomberg, who's an economist who was certainly ahead of the curve in predicting the Wall Street crash of 2008. And he was saying, look, this is an assault on labor, which is bad structurally. It's another deepening of loss of jobs and wages. It's going to expand people in temp work. It's going to have an inflationary effect because you're just pumping money into the financial system, and then, potentially have an inflationary effect. And then, and most importantly for this, you're just not acknowledging that the problem here isn't that things aren't open and people are jonesing to get out and do things. The polls do show that most people want to be in quarantine because most people don't want to die or have a family member die, or just even go through the process of getting sick for several weeks. That's also pretty awful. And most people also kind of, in terms of their economic lives, don't have the capacity to be sick like that because we don't have a social infrastructure in this country. So all that is happening. The nurses are out demonstrating. Please support the nurses. Please, as much as you can, focus your social media attention on that protest.
Yeah, amplify it too, because
that's very important to amplify.
The other bullshit reopen protests, that they're going to get amplified by all types of cable media. So amplify this stuff on your Facebook and those sorts of channels where you reach the normal people in your life. We need to be in charge of this moment, I guess.
Yeah. And the more the word gets out, the more other people will hopefully jump on to this movement in the same way that the mainstream media might do a bad thing and actually pull working class people into the reopen protests in a way that would not be constructive, we can do the good version of that. We can amplify the ways that normal working people are standing up for their rights all over the country and all over the world. And it's spreading. There's actually a Wikipedia page now on all of the strike actions that have happened since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a real phenomenon, and it's growing.
Yeah, and we're talking to the directors at the National Nurses United to get some of them on this program. So
awesome.
Oh, hell yeah.
Oh, that's really, really good. And this is also my point here, that what you do is you identify, because if you can't look dispassionately at something like the reopen protests, you will miss the areas where people with disgusting politics can exploit vulnerabilities. So you have to be able to look at things somewhat dispassionately. If scolding and moralizing people worked, then, Hillary Clinton's about to be reelected president. You have to have the capacity to say, what is it that they are speaking to, even if it's 5% of why they're there, that is valid or legitimate. Then you need to highlight all the other elements of what they're doing that are innately toxic. And by the way, they've made that very easy in the last couple of weeks. The first reopen protests were much, and I don't know what happened, but the first reopen protests, they've always had this crazy and extremist element. But there was they were communicating enough of, I just need to get back to work, that it was a much more threatening message. They have gone, the last couple of weeks, they've come out and been like, we're going to do, we're going to do racist blackface shows. We're going to do the Nazi Confederate flags, the guns, all of that. And again, I don't think that there is a silent majority for that. I don't. I actually think most people, including people that would definitely not consider themselves on the left and are normies, actually find that kind of fascist, racist cosplaying embarrassing and repulsive, because it is. And that's why Fox News was trying to discipline their people, obviously not on moral grounds, but on visual and strategic grounds, to not show up like that. So anyways, you dispassionately look at what people can appeal to that is legitimate, the concern about making money in this time. Then you zero in and hit at their vulnerabilities, like the AstroTurf funding. And then, and I would say at this point, 3 weeks ago, I'm someone saying take reopen seriously and try to have a serious analysis of it in case it takes off. And now I'm saying, like, look, if somebody shows up and they do something dangerous or something that can make them look particularly bad, I'll highlight it and talk about it. But besides that, I'm actually pretty bored and uninterested. And I want to take my time to talk about the nurses' protests and the rent strikes and the Amazon workers and the Target workers, because these are the most important things happening anyways. They are happening. And we do need to counteract the fact that these right-wing demonstrations have built-in political and media advantages. So that's my sort of three-step process. Because I realize, like, when you do shows like this, sometimes it certain things can appear like contradictions, which aren't really. But at any rate,
and I should also add that de Blasio and the police commissioner just announced that we are not allowed to have protests in New York City for the duration of this thing, which, I get it. They think it's always a risk, even if you're observing the 6-foot rule and wearing PPE. But, like, stop giving us things to protest about, right? Like, if you can force nurses to go to work without adequate equipment, you cannot tell them not to stand outside that place of work and protest.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. If safety is number one, then safety is number one. I mean, that's it. Kelly McEnany is the new press secretary. Kaylee, sorry. She was around. She's like a returning cast member, right?
No, Miki, I believe, has fairly has met with her extensively.
Extensively. She's like a Fox News long timer.
Green room, extensive green room.
Wait, okay, all right. So I'm confusing her. I thought she was somebody who used to work for Trump and then got thrown out and now is back.
No.
All right, whatever.
She is the current campaign spokeswoman as well, I believe, or was before this.
Oh, no. She's a very competent person.
She's a very competent person.
Girl boss.
So here she is. And, you know, I remember a couple of weeks ago when there was, when the numbers were talking about a couple 100,000 people dying, and Trump said, I want to come right underneath the numbers, right underneath. Well, check out the new numbers that, which are totally possible. Could be even more if they push forward with this. These are the new numbers that they're putting forward as part of an overall argument about "quote unquote" reopening the economy.
There were supposed to be 2.2 million deaths, and we're at a point where we're far lower than that, and it's thanks to the great work of the task force and to the leadership of President Trump.
Well, whose idea was it initially to wind it down?
Again, I'm not going further. The president has answered this 4 times today. John?
I just have a question.
So basically, again, this is the classic dynamic that we have with these people, which is here's a number that we're not going to that we're not reaching. We're not reaching it because we're social distancing. And now we need to get out of social distancing and actually risk going back to the possibility of hitting that number. Even as, by the way, even with the measures put in place, thousands of people are dying a day.
We may hit 200 with the social distancing. 200 was one of the high numbers that they were making fun of at the beginning.
Right.
Like, I mean, I hope we don't, but like it's possible that we hit that with the social distancing. And yeah, like that 2 million. I mean, Christ, was anybody thinking we were literally going to not do anything and hit 2.2 million deaths? I mean, it's possible. Maybe that's a low enough bar to give the Republicans, but like that would have been, I mean, that would have been mass murder.
But that's the new number you're going to hear. You're going to you're going to hear it's exactly it. This won't even hit 100,000. This is like the flu, and now it's going to go. Could have been 2.2. What the hell's the problem? Get back to McDonald's. Get back out there.
Yeah.
So that's the new I have no doubt you'll hear that number a lot more. And here is McEnany talking about Donald Trump's warrior statements. We're a nation of warriors.
Americans, the president's using that phrase as well. What's the thinking behind using that description? And is that basically asking Americans to put themselves in harm's way like warriors do?
Not in the slightest. It's actually the opposite. You know, the president's been clear that at this moment, you know, we're at a wartime moment where we're fighting the invisible enemy. And by that, I mean COVID-19. And on the contrary, the notion that the American people are warriors, they're warriors because they've stayed home. They're warriors because they've social distanced. They're warriors because this mitigation effort is something that could only be done by the American people coming together and making really hard sacrifices. And the American public has done that, and we salute each of you around the country that have listened to these guidelines. I know it's been difficult. I know it's been hard, but it's because of you that we're at this place where we can reopen the country.
Just to be clear, that's the opposite of what the president says, specifically because he says Americans must be warriors to reopen the economy. You're saying they've already been warriors by staying home.
We're saying the exact same thing. The president says they're warriors to reopen because guess what? In order to get to reopening, you have to social distance. You had to put it together, those very hard choices that allowed us to get to a point where we have one of the lowest mortality rates in the world, and that's because of the American people. So it took the American people being warriors to get us to the point of reopening. Blake.
Thanks, Kelly. I want to ask you about best practices.
Does anybody have okay? So Trump was clearly saying like, it's time to not be wusses. We got to get out there. Now she's saying a real warrior physically distances, socially distances, but it's the same thing because you have been. So now we're going to go to the second phase of warriorship.
Yeah. She's encouraging them by saying they've always been warriors, Whereas Trump's saying you got to find that inner warrior now, bring him out, get back to work, flip the bird.
And in neither of those are people compensated like war fighters typically are by a massive empire.
Well, that's my proposal, Matt, is that
I'm a vet.
when this war is done and we're all veterans of the COVID-19 era, maybe we get some VA benefits and we bring about a national healthcare system.
When I'm at my gaming PC, I'm actually in the trenches.
Well, everything is on spec now. So we'll have to see if the president is happy with the job we've done fighting this war.
I also like how Kaylee's like, we're fighting the invisible enemy. And then she's like, the coronavirus. It's like, oh, I'm glad there's not another invisible enemy that you're supposed to tell us about.
Yeah, I thought that one was pretty visible.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. Oh, so in other words, because we can't physically see it. So we're all aware of it, but because I got you.
Oh, I thought this was like
the
the UFO press briefing. Do we have invisible aliens now or something, Kaylee? Like,
oh boy. I just really hope this makes people question this system that we have and its utter irrationality and amorality towards human life. But you know what? Who knows? A girl can dream.
War is not a good terminology to fit this moment. I mean, it's just like the idea of like a war on an impersonal act of nature, which even, I mean, not to sound too woo-woo here, but like the virus just wants to be part of us, man. But like, I mean, but honestly, it's just, it's ludicrous to like this martial terminology. And it does, I mean, it has serious consequences, right? I mean, that's, Bill Barr, wartime, suspend habeas corpus, type of thing. I mean, because of course that's the other great height of contradiction of these right-wing governments, right? Whether we're talking about Trump or Bolsonaro or whoever else, where on one hand, oh my God, taking the bare minimum of precautions during a pandemic is a Stalin-esque threat to our very basis of civil liberties. And then on the other hand, I mean, these people have been eating at privacy, civil liberties, building surveillance states at a rat pace. I mean, certainly that's another component of what Andrew Cuomo is talking about in New York, frankly. I mean, let's get Bill Gates in to quote unquote reimagine education, and God knows what we can do to an already insanely over surveilled city. So but the point is, when you use war language, that is very effective in facilitating eroding civil liberties. So it's not just that it's goofy and ridiculous and a weird analogy to speak about a scientific process as, an armed conflict, but it has very tangible implications for immigration policies, for civil liberties, and everything else that they're trying to do.
Yeah, a war is conducted against people, right? And in the absence of a human enemy, the enemy becomes sick people, and that will obviously be mediated by all of the racial and class gradations in our society, like we've already been seeing, right? The cops, they go to a park full of white people, they give them masks. They see a young black man on the street without a mask, they kick his ass, and the bystanders too. Like, that's how this is going down.
Yeah, I mean, look, things always filter through the pre-existing, through the politics, obviously, of course, and it's disgusting, it's despicable, but it's expected in a very, in a way that obviously we need to challenge and fight against strongly. Let's go to clip number 5. I think this is is this a TV exchange or a hearing? This is a hearing. Okay, so this is Tom Frieden, who was at Barack Obama's CDC. And essentially they're talking about, would it be safer to reopen if there's contact tracing in place? Representative Andy Harris is going to have a pretty solid response when it comes to this whole cost-benefit analysis and safety of reopening thing. Let's check this out.
Also a medical doctor.
Andy Harris is also, Dr. Andy Harris is also a medical doctor. He looks like, If this is Andy Harris, he very much has the look of an annoying doctor turned suburban Republican congressman. This is actually what I would guess he was if I just saw his picture. Let's play the clip.
We just have very intensive education processes so that every American follows social distancing, wearing a mask, and hand hygiene. So we kind of hammer this in because these are the principles, and get a test if you're symptomatic.
So I think that's correct. I think we can do both, and we have to do both because this is a very infectious virus and it's very deadly for certain people.
But the criteria for reopening include the need, and I've seen this where it's been suggested, don't reopen until you have contact testing in place.
What we can say is you will be safer if you're able to open with contact tracing.
We're safer if we're not born. We're safer from death if we're not born, right? I mean, the bottom line is there's some element of risk, and I bring this back to stay at home might work in New York because if you leave your home in New York, you're going to get on a train, you're going to get on a subway, you're going to get in a crowded street. But if you're in parts of my district, you're going to leave home, get in your car or truck, drive to a store that has almost no customers in it, conduct your business, and go back home because that's normally the way you live. So why would you insist that, or why is there insistence that stay at home is the broad blanket statement, it's effective, because I'm not sure it adds anything more in the instance I just gave you in a rural area. So why do we have a kind of one-size-fits-all approach when we can be much more nuanced about it?
The concept of physical distancing is an important one. And in the scenario you outlined, if the individual goes to the store and, for example, calls in advance, picks up the order at the front, that's a very low-risk interaction. If you go out and work outdoors, that's a very low-risk interaction.
Right. So I would suggest, I visited and a couple of the stay-at-home things that just don't make sense to me.
So, first of all, we live in a country together. So there's an interdependence to these choices, even if you're in different places geographically. But
no, people never move from an urban area to a rural one or vice versa.
What's also interesting to me is that it isn't like what he's talking about is already happening, including in New York City. So you're conflating that basically safety practices with stores that are already open and hopefully following with a mass push to reopen everything, including intrinsic, like you can't social distance cutting hair. You can't social distance giving a tattoo. You can't social distance at a gym or giving a massage or whatever. So like, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a overall reopen push, not essentially, because I haven't heard any stories about people in rural areas not able to work the fields or go to the grocery store. People go to the grocery store in New York. People go to the grocery store everywhere. That's not what's in play. What's in play is the premature pushing of masses of people into commercial and social interactions everywhere. And then of course the big ticket item in that clip is just Republican sophistry always at work. It's like, absolutely. The safest thing to do is to have not been born. And therefore, we should go reopen the economy in a pandemic. And if we look at a place like South Korea, which is reopening to some real extent, had elections, whereas center-left government just performed very well, partially because of how successfully they're handling this. They were able to contain it. Right? There was a stat that I think more people have died in Springfield, Massachusetts, close by where I grew up, than in the entirety of the Republic of South Korea. That is the consequence of national health insurance. And it's so funny because Republicans, the right doesn't want to hear about South Korea at all. And the kind of technocratic neo-lib types are obsessed with the tracing and testing systems, which is part of it. But it's built on a foundation of robust and universal for everybody. My buddy Ben Burgess went there to teach. He's immediately on the national health system a couple years ago. So, that's how you do it. You want to reopen, you have to have universal national health care. We don't have that. We got to go very slow and try to ramp things up for it to be safe.
Oh, well, I do think this clip served to highlight why it's important to have the right to a safe and legal abortion, though, right? Because like he said, you're safer from death if you're not born. Think of all those innocent little children whose lives we can safeguard 100% by making sure they're never born.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. That's a fantastic point. All right, let's do one final piece of sound. Let me see. Let's play this clip. We talked about it earlier, but speaking of highlighting rallies that we want to make sure get serious attention at this time, we opened the show talking about the Ahmaud Arbery case, the young man who was murdered by a vigilante lynch crew while jogging in Georgia. And there's a big push right now. I mean, there's connections with the people who murdered him with the DA. One of the gunmen served 30 years in local law enforcement. And so this is the type of thing that is not going to be addressed legally without a very big organized political and media push. So we outlined the case up top on today's show, and this is just a brief clip of a rally demanding justice for him in Georgia.
What's that you want justice? I got one thing you want justice. Hold on. This is another thing. Like, what's that you want justice? I got one thing you want.
So yeah, it's just a 10-second clip. But again, in terms of focusing on the actual protests and political energy we want to highlight right now, we will keep following that case very closely and see what happens with the grand jury in terms of charges around, again, what could only be described as a cold-blooded murder, obviously.
Yeah, TikTok grand jury.
Sorry?
I said TikTok grand jury.
TikTok grand jury, indeed. So we're going to sign off. Jamie, you have your thing tonight at 9 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be on DMTV at 3. And everybody will be back tomorrow. Stay safe, everybody. Thanks.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there.